So what actually is Alzheimer's disease and how do we classify it? Well, most people are probably familiar with the idea that Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia. There are other forms of dementia disease, as we'll discuss later, and that Alzheimer's involves a loss of memory abilities. There's also a loss of thinking capacity, which we can think of as cognition, and we see changes in behaviour. This can involve anxiety, agitation, aggression, hallucinations, changes in sleep patterns, and these changes vary depending on the progression of the disease from the early to the later very severe form of the disease. Now, an excellent place to find out information about these different clinical manifestations of the disease is the USA's Alzheimer's Association website. And in particular, I would point you to this particular page here, and I'll show it actually on the next slide. As mentioned, these are clinical changes and they vary between the early and late stages of the disease. Also, it's important to realise that the definition of Alzheimer's disease has changed over time. And the modern definition that is fairly widely accepted includes what I would call molecular elements. You may have heard of something called biomarkers. And these are basically molecular changes which are thought to indicate the presence or otherwise of the disease. But that's a discussion for a later video. Here is a screenshot from the Alzheimer's Association's website, and where they describe the stages and the behaviours that you'll see during Alzheimer's disease, specifically written for caregivers and so forth. And it's a really excellent resource, and I recommend people go there to find out more information about this. But what I want to talk about today specifically is how we can classify Alzheimer's disease into different types. We can actually classify it into 4 different forms, and that's based on 2 parameters, as you would say, 2 differences. Now, the first parameter or difference that we're going to look at is the age at which Alzheimer's disease occurs. Most Alzheimer's disease occurs in older individuals, and an arbitrary threshold has been set at 65 years. And if you develop Alzheimer's disease after 65 years, then that's said to be late onset disease. If you develop Alzheimer's disease before 65 years, that's said to be the early onset form of the disease. But we can also classify Alzheimer's disease in terms of its genetics. Now, there are forms of Alzheimer's disease which are inherited in families where we can definitely see the inheritance. For example, you may be familiar with family trees, pedigrees, we call them in genetics, and you can see how the different individuals within that pedigree are affected with the disease as we move down the generations. Now, familial forms of Alzheimer's disease are due to mutations in only a small number of genes. There are basically 3 and possibly 4 genes involved. These genes are, and I'm only giving you the short names here, APP, PSEN1, PSEN2, and a 4th gene which is still somewhat debated as to whether its mutations in it can actually cause with any certainty the early onset form of the disease, and that's called SORL1. But basically for these 3 genes here, there are particular mutations in each of those genes which with almost certainly will lead a person to have Alzheimer's disease. Now, that's the familial form of Alzheimer's disease inherited in families. There's also what we call the sporadic form of Alzheimer's disease. And we call it sporadic because there is no definite pattern of familial inheritance. And most of the Alzheimer's disease occurring in older individuals is in fact sporadic. Now, even though there's no definite pattern of inheritance that we can see within families, does not mean that we can't see the involvement of particular genetic variants or mutations, if you want to call them, but let's call them genetic variants. You can see the involvement of particular genetic variants in changing your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Now, you can think of these variants as changes in genes that change the likelihood or not that you'll develop the disease, but they won't. No one of these variants will with certainty cause you to develop the disease. Now, the best known gene in which a risk variant occurs is the ApoE gene, and I'm sure we'll have opportunity to talk about that in later videos because it's a very interesting gene. But there are a large number of other genes, only a few of which I've listed here, which have been found to be involved in your risk of Alzheimer's disease. So overall, we can classify Alzheimer's disease into 4 types. We have the late onset sporadic. We also have early onset sporadic if it occurs before 65 years, but there's no obvious pattern of familial inheritance that we can see. We have the early onset familial, and in terms of the familial forms of the disease where there's a definite genetic inheritance, most of this will be early onset. And there are actually also identifiable cases of late onset familial disease where you're getting the disease with certainty, but it's occurring after 65 years of age. So if you actually look at the proportions of those people developing Alzheimer's disease, their contributions or their, how we would classify them into these different types, we would see that the great majority are actually late onset sporadic Alzheimer's disease, with a smaller amount of early onset sporadic and an approximately equal amount of early onset familial, and then a very small amount of late onset familial Alzheimer's disease. Now, I'm a geneticist and the people I work with are geneticists, and genetics gives us a pathway into trying to understand how Alzheimer's disease occurs, because we can identify particular genes that we can focus on and then have a look at how those genes are functioning and how those genes are changed by mutations to cause Alzheimer's disease. So looking at the genetics is a way of trying to dissect the mechanisms that are involved in causing this disease. So in my laboratory, we focus on the early onset familial mutations. These are the mutations that with certainty will cause the disease. And so in other words, we look at mutations in these, actually all of these 4 genes are ones that we've looked at, and we've looked at mutations in those genes to see what they're doing. So that's what I'm talking about in this video, and we'll go on to further topics in the future.